Hello, I'm Eric Snodgrass, and thank you for watching today's long-range forecast video brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. This analysis is being provided for perspective only, and any decision made based upon this presentation is the sole responsibility of the person making the decision. Finally, please remember that all long-range weather forecasting is speculative by nature. Well, to get things started here, the northern U.S., the western United States, and the Canadian prairies were very, very cold early this morning. Some locations in here were 20 to 30 degrees colder than average, and that cold air tucked away deep in that trough is on its way east. Now, just to show you how cold it was, each dot you see here is a location that was approaching or surpassing record low temperatures. And so this was very, very anomalously cold for this time of year. Now, the jet stream flow pattern that got us here is one that is quite split right now in the Gulf of Alaska and across the west coast. You can see it here. I'm tracing out the polar branch of the jet stream, and here is the subtropical branch of the jet stream. Now, when we see that split happening in the west, this does a few things to us that is quite challenging. Number one, this is going to reduce long-range predictability. This type of blocking pattern, this disrupted pattern, means picking up on the subtle features that will be controlling the longer-range weather forecast are not going to be easily discernible by someone like me. Secondly, when we see a pattern like this, this is a pattern that's quite stagnant, and therefore the features that move through it are often difficult to pick up on. Thirdly, if we continue to see a pattern like this across the eastern half of the United States, we would expect to see very volatile weather inside that area that I just circled. So my last lesson here is that if we see this pattern showing up a lot this cold season, it is something that's going to make for a very active eastern half of the United States. Now, what it's doing in the near term here, that stagnant pattern over in the west coast still has us on the lookout here for the Santa Ana winds, the high wind warnings, and also the threat for the fires that are going to spread and new ones to start. But deep in that trough, we got some colder air, such that here in the mountains in Southern California, getting into the Mojave Desert, we've got hard freeze warnings. We've also got them out for parts of Texas and Oklahoma, and then getting over here into parts of Missouri, with frost advisories stretching here into parts of Tennessee and parts of the Ohio River Valley. On the back side, we're watching winter weather, and we do have winter weather advisories that actually do stretch into parts of Iowa, Illinois, and southern Wisconsin, although they didn't show up here on the map that the weather.gov produces. So let's talk about that system. Here's what we're looking at over the next 3 days in terms of the probability of picking up at least 2 inches of snowfall. So you can see the color bar down here as to the locations, getting up to about an 80% chance at picking up a couple of inches of snowfall, really right in through this corridor that I just drew the line through here. Now, I know recently you've seen some pretty wild snowfall maps. We have to always be careful looking at the raw model output on this. That is where you can really get misled on the total amount of snow that is going to be falling here. So let's look at the probability here of picking up 2 inches. This is now 4 inches. So you can see there is a narrow corridor in this area that does have, as you can see from the colors over here, maybe a 40 to 60% chance of seeing at least 4 inches. But big snowfall totals getting over 8. I know a lot of folks were tweeting this out and talking about it on Facebook and on the news. This is what the actual data look like here. Now, there will be a narrow corridor in through here, like we just said, that has the potential for getting some heavier snowfall amounts. But it is certainly not getting up to, I saw some reports of people thinking 18 inches of snow. That was just never in the cards here. But let's watch this system evolve here over the next few days. And this animation takes us through Halloween and gets us all the way out here to Friday evening. Now, the main story here, if we just step this back, is as the system curls up, a lot of very cold rain out ahead of it here, moving through the eastern Corn Belt. The colder air on the backside bringing the changeover to snow here. This is 3 a.m. Thursday, so maybe that changeover happens right here along Interstate 55 between Chicago and St. Louis. But as the snow continues in this area, this is going to be just below freezing, and therefore could be a pretty wet and nasty snowfall event on the backside. Now, throughout the day on Thursday, we're going to have to watch the southern tail of this for giving us the greatest risk of seeing some strong to severe storms as the main frontal boundary approaches the Appalachian Mountains here. But on the back side of this, very cold, very windy conditions back here. But the only place that might get in some trick-or-treating that would still be warm will be anywhere out ahead of this line right here. So this is 6 p.m. Central Time, so 7 p.m. East Coast time here on Thursday. So we can see the main line here approaching like Raleigh, North Carolina at this particular point. But on the backside, cold air, snow coming through parts of Michigan and Indiana. And then you'll see on the backside of this, in that trough, widely scattered snow showers moving down through the north central part of the United States as we get through the day on Friday. Okay, total precipitation out of the next 3 days here, the next 60 hours here. Again, we're watching out for a potential for some heavy rainfall in through this area and snow here on the back side of this. But that heavy rainfall that you see there may be coming in with some strong to severe storms, and this is all kind of collecting here in parts of the Northeast. We're adding all of this to this map. This is what we've had over the last week. And we know that because of that cutoff low that kind of snuck through and went up like this, we were able to draw quite a bit of moisture in. We saw some very heavy rainfall down here in and along the Mississippi River in points just to the east and west of it as well. Now, why I'm bringing this up is because I can now that I've seen the precipitation we're going to get for the next couple of days, what we just had over the last week, I can now go back and verify a forecast that I produced back at the end of September. At that time, I was leaning pretty heavily on our global models, and we were suggesting that this corridor was staying on the wetter side of things. We were seeing this area showing up wet, but we were anticipating possibly drier time periods inside of that region I just circled. I was very clear that I had no idea what was going to be happening here in the northern plains, the Canadian prairies, and then getting here into the western Corn Belt. That was an area that we had such great model disagreement that I just didn't have a clue as to what was going to happen week to week. Well, let me show you what did happen. Now, this is an interesting map. I have nearly 40 years of high spatial resolution rainfall data across the United States. So I went back over those 40 years, and the numbers you see on here are my anticipation of where the month of October will rank in terms of wettest or driest. So when you look at it, everywhere that you see white, that's where I think it'll be the wettest October on record. And you can see the color shading plus the numbers telling you from wettest to driest. So 1 is wettest, 39th would be driest. Now, where we had the most uncertainty, it was a very, very wet month. And that is pretty clear. We knew that this area was going to be wet, but certainly that short wave that snuck through there, plus Nestor coming through, plus the rainfall we're going to be getting over the next couple of days is going to help that out. But remember, we did see a drier corridor in through here. But overall, there were some places in there where it was very wet, like right in through here, this area, and also here in parts of Iowa. But there are some drier swaths in through there. We did okay, I think, in the Pacific Northwest as well. But you know what? I was a professor 15 years before I came here and worked full-time at Nutrien. And if you ask me to give myself a grade, I'm going to give myself a C- on this one, maybe a D+. Some places we did okay, but overall, I missed on some of the clues that were suggesting how things were going to be in parts of the north central United States and getting over into the mid-Mississippi River Valley. Those were two areas I struggled with greatly over the last month, predicting in the longer term. So what are we seeing now? Let's just get back into the forecast. This is now days 4 through 10, both the GFS on the left, European on the right. So when we look at this, this is now after the current system goes through. Our global models are hinting at very similar pictures. With the cold air that's coming in through here, we could get systems that come in from this direction. But because they're coming in from that northwest trajectory, they don't get to tap into Gulf of Mexico moisture very easily here, at least in the week that is day 4 through day 10. That's why both the European and the GFS are painting it relatively dry for a big section of the United States. Remember, this is compared to average. It doesn't mean that no precipitation, but after the system goes through, we will see a less volatile time period. Cold, but less volatile. Now, to see this a little bit better, I want you to watch this animation of precipitable water. You can see things clearing out. See the drier air coming in as we get in here into the day on Friday? I want you to watch this for two things. That drier air sticks around. This is now the 4th and the 5th of the month. Now, once we get out that far, we're going to have to watch very carefully for how far north we can bring some of this moisture back in here in the eastern part of the United States. But over here, we're going to talk about this in a second. I really want you to focus on what's happening in the Pacific. You see, at this point, now getting out to the 9th, 10th, and 11th, some of our models are finally cluing in on a breakdown of that split pattern, maybe bringing in the first meaningful moist air into the West Coast, which will help eliminate our fire threat in this area. But this is still 10 or 11 days away from us here, and we're resting on the operational models actually picking up on this pattern. We do see though, see the big dry kind of half circle you see there? That is still indicative of the upper level flow pattern cooling things off in this part of the country, keeping things dry over in this area. But when we look at all of that by looking specifically at our week 2, this is only week 2 precipitation, a couple of things we notice. The dry biases here are becoming less. See the moisture plume in this area? That is what I'm going to be watching to work its way over here as we get out again to like the 11th, 12th, and 13th of the month. We also saw at that time some resurgence of some moisture coming out of the Gulf of Mexico, and therefore we can see that this area in through here may be going back over toward what looks like maybe near average to wetter than average pattern. So that gets us through week 2. Now when we talk about temperatures, this is kind of neat. This is looking at the next 5 days. The coldest place on the planet compared to average is right here. Compared to average, coldest place on the planet. So this split flow pattern is doing that to the central United States. So days 0 through 5, so today through the next 5 days, yes, the cold push is coming through, and that is going to really bottom our temperatures out. It is going to feel like early winter here. In days 6 through 10, we can now really fully see that highly amplified pattern kind of orbiting around a trough sitting in this area. We're off my charts again in terms of temperature anomalies coming through the Canadian prairies into the north central United States. Temperatures rebounding on the west coast, though, as we see overall the flow doing something a bit more like this. We see that continuing into the 11 to 15 day time period as well. So we are going to get through the first half of this month with this colder bias. And to finish out this video, what I want to do is I want to talk about what are the chances of that hanging on and what does it mean toward precipitation. Does this pattern change? So let's get right into it. First thing I'm going to do is I want to look at our model trends. We're going to do models first, teleconnections second. What you've got up here is the most recent run here. I'll put a 1 in it. This is the previous run and the run before that. So these are given to us about every 4 days. Let's just take a look at what they're showing. First thing that we've seen, as we look out here to the time period November 11th through the 18th, the model trend has been such that we've continued to stay drier in this area. See it in all 3. We've now seen wetter conditions coming into the Pacific Northwest where previous runs have been drier for this time period, so that is a change. And with that change in the North Pacific, I'm specifically talking about the development of this trough, we've actually seen the model picking up on a wetter bias in through this corridor as well, where previously it was a little bit farther to the south and east. So that's our near-term model trend in week 3 for precipitation. Let's now look at week 4. We see out at that particular time period that stuff changing in the North Pacific Ocean is trying to keep this area on the wetter side of things. That's shifting a little bit to the west from what we saw from the previous run and the run before that. Overall, this paints for an active pattern for a big section of the United States as we progress through the month of November. But my greatest area of uncertainty might be over in this corridor over here from some of our latest model runs and also in the Pacific Northwest. That's going to be the greatest challenge. And again, all of that is coming from the fact that we're seeing the North Pacific right now blocked up. And what that might mean for the strength of the subtropical jet and if the flow still has to do something like this in the North Pacific. That's the trickiest part of this forecast. But we need to look at these model trends first, okay? Let's now move it over toward temperatures. One interesting thing that I've been seeing in the models, and on top I have week 3, so I'll put a 3, oh that was horrible handwriting. I'll put week 3 up here, and down here I have week 4, and again we're looking at older model runs the farther you go to the right on these images. We've seen moderation in our temperatures with the colder air sticking up here. So the question is, does the end of the month still hang on to the colder air that keeps penetrating farther toward the south and east, or does it moderate some? So to answer that question, I want to flip now over to looking at our global teleconnections. And this will be the end of our video here. We are watching these regions. These 3 are tied together, okay? We're watching warm up here, the very warm North Pacific, that's the positive phase of the PDO, and the very warm parts of the Bering Sea and regions north of Alaska. Secondly, we need to be watching our El Nino region to see what's going on with temperatures there, and is anything going on with the Indian Ocean dipole that needs to be discussed. Because this particular setup through winter right now favors a very strong subtropical jet stream. and that would mean a very active eastern half of the United States. So let's see what each thing is doing. First, the Indian Ocean Dipole reached a peak here. This is a time series that goes all the way back to 1985. That's what's over here. And the only times historically that it's done this was back in 1997 and in 1994. Now, these two time periods that you're looking at here, where we had these peaks, these two time periods are quite interesting because when we reach these peaks, they typically very quickly fell back off. And I want to know what that means. So when we look at that, we notice that our most recent peak right in through here has already started to decrease. And the forecast is for the Indian Ocean Dipole to slowly come back down into neutral territory by the time we finish 2019 and begin 2020. So we're losing this as a dominant signal over the next, let's call it 60 days or so. Now we're going to come back to that in a few moments, but what might that mean? Well, we have noticed, going back to September, that has given us this strong easterly wind here. You can see it showing up in black over here in my map on the left. And that's given us a westerly wind here, kind of giving us this indication that maybe El Nino conditions, light conditions, were returning here. And it was also getting our MJO stuck in this phase 1 over here. Well, the Mad-Julian oscillation has jumped out of phase 1 briefly and come back over to null phase. And here's the question I'm trying to answer. If we do by the end of this month, and by the end of November, getting into December, get the Indian Ocean Dipole to collapse, what historically happens when that occurs? Well, this is what I want to tell you. Historically, when we come off these peaks, the odds of the MJO coming out very strongly in phases 8, 1, and 2, strongly in phases 8, 1, and 2 are relatively low. It is more likely that it'll come out somewhere over here in phases 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now, why is that important? It's important for South America because phases 3 through 6 tend to be the drier phases for Brazil's main growing area. And if that means at the end of December, getting into January, we come out in phase 3, 4, and 5, that could signal a drier time period in South America that would be at a critical time period for soybeans. Now, it's just something we all need to be watching together. That's all I'm trying to tell you here is that this isn't a slam dunk. We're going to have to watch this carefully. But this could mean something quite important for South America given the delays they've had in planting their first crop beans. Let's take this discussion another step further. We have noticed that since mid-September that the westerly winds have allowed the Central Pacific to warm up. We can even see that the warmer water here below the ocean surface is slowly migrating up over here toward the South American side of the ocean, and over here is the Australian side. What that has done is those westerly winds have kept our Southern Oscillation Index below 0, but remember, it's got to be below -8 to be really considered El Nino, so it's kind of flirting with those values. But this indicates some warming that's happening in this area over the coming days and weeks. And we need to be able to put all of this together and keep it into the context of our global winds. Now, we saw, starting in September through October, below average global winds, but they've been increasing since, although they're still below 0. Now, if we kind of stitch this all together, this is what I want you to see. We're going to talk primarily about temperature first here, okay? Now, we have negative Southern Oscillation Index. That's indicative of El Nino. We have a warming trend in the Central Pacific. That is also more El Nino-like. And we keep getting these westerly wind bursts. That's also El Nino-like. If that continues through the month of November, this is what the correlation looks like in our temperature patterns across North America. Now, one of our strongest connections is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is very warm water in the North Pacific, specifically in the Gulf of Alaska and around Alaska. If that continues, which by all indications it will, this is what the temperature patterns look like. Now, our global angular momentum is still low, but it's been increasing over the last 30 days, and it's quite close to 0. Now, if we use that as a dominant indicator, well, it's a little bit on the opposite phase of things. But I'm telling you, global angular momentum this time of year with its current value being close to 0 is not a good indicator. What's going on with the quasi-biennial oscillation? Well, its values have been decreasing since reaching a peak earlier this year, and it's now below 10 in its value. So what does that mean? Well, if the QBO keeps going toward negative values, that reinforces this pattern. Now, we know the first half of the month of November is going to look just like this. We've already got this cold air in place, and it's sticking around at least through the 15th. My indications are these. If we keep the ENSO, PDO, and the QBO all in its same configuration, the chances of us seeing temperature pattern look something like this relatively high throughout the entirety of the month of November. I have a lot of uncertainty, though, past the 15th because our global models are calling for a bit of moderation. So I'm going to leave you with these caveats. 1, don't let this be misleading, okay? These global teleconnections that I just used to paint this picture, the correlations are generally below 0.4. They're not 0.8, 0.9. They're below 0.4. Secondly, the only dominant one is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and that's more of a decadal, longer-term feature, not a short-term one. So I'm going to tell you that right now I have very little guidance on our precipitation patterns, and I'm going to anticipate more blocking happening in the North Pacific. And that tends to retrograde a pattern. That tends to make the pattern very stagnant and very difficult to predict more than just a few days in advance. I'm expecting things to continue to stay volatile here, and I think we need to watch very carefully to see what happens with our subtropical jet stream, because we may be going into an early winter that features quite a bit more split flow, something like this out in the Pacific. And in that case, that could spell a very active eastern 2/3 of the United States in terms of weather. But again, with this pattern, which is piggybacking off of what I explained in last week's video, there's a lot of uncertainty, just a lot of uncertainty. So I think at that, I'll go ahead and leave it here and wrap this one up. And I hope you found this instructive and intuitive, but I hope you with me are going to watch the week-by-week fluctuations in this pattern to see how it all plays out. We'll give ourselves another grade next month to see how we did, but with that, I'll wrap it up right here. Thank you for watching. We'll talk to you again soon.